Good morning. This is our fourth episode of the series, Why You Should Care, from the Financial Times and We're All Human Foundation. I'm very excited to give it to our panelist, Simon Mundy, Moral Money Editor from the Financial Times. So take it over.
Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in today. We've got a great panel for you and we're going to be discussing COP26. I'm sure everyone watching was very much aware of what was happening in Glasgow earlier this month. I was there for the whole thing and well, I have my own thoughts on what happened there. Perhaps we'll go into some of that during the session. But first of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So in no particular order, we have Emma Torres, who's VP of the Americas for SDSN, Matt Tranchin, who's SVP of Impact at EarthX, Edie Lush, who's executive producer and co-host at Global Goalscast, Lance Gould, founder and CEO of the Brooklyn Story Lab, and Vasa Seidel, who's the campaign director at the Oxygen Project. So Emma, to start with you and to give you quite a broad question to answer how you will, what did you make of COP26?
I think COP26, in my view, has been a positive step, and certainly I have witnessed many COPs. I have to say that, and I do feel that the progress has been significant, and it's been significant also because it was under difficult conditions, not only because of the pandemic and so on. I think it's been successful from my perspective also, particularly as I follow very closely the Amazon. We launched a report of the science panel of the Amazon at the COP, and I was very happy that we had this pledge of the forest. Not sufficient, a lot to be done, to be specific, but it is a good direction. I think the fact that the forest, nature, indigenous peoples were extremely present in the COP was also very positive. There are many other positive things, but I think I would leave it like that because I'm sure all of you can complement. But I do feel it was a very good COP in my view. The challenges are big, but it's a step in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Emma. So Emma has a broadly positive sense of what happens at COP. Do any of the other panelists have a different feeling about it? Were any of the other panelists more, because I think we can all agree there were some positive steps at COP26. We can look at, for example, the increased funding for climate adaptation, which a lot of people that I've met, especially in developing countries, feel strongly about. We can appreciate the fact that for the first time ever, amazingly, fossil fuels were actually mentioned in the final text that came out of the COP on the 26th time of asking, which is quite something. So clearly there were positive steps forward. But did any of the panelists have a less positive view? Did any of the panelists have more of a sense of disappointment coming out of COP26?
I respectfully disagree with the positive perspective on COP. I think that we're in a situation where we're really kind of in the emergency room and we're bleeding heavily, and COP26 put some band-aids and some sutures on some of the wounds. There were some good positive steps, such as the deforestation and the methane agreement. I think ultimately the biggest decision was to kick the can down the road when it comes to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they decided to do that next year. But ultimately, in terms of the IPCC report, where we are, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, said that we're in code red right now. And we're already starting to see some of the irreversible consequences of climate change, and we're not doing enough. And the last quick point to make is in terms of fossil fuel, I think there were 503 representatives from the fossil fuel industry in the hall, and that's more than any single country delegation. So I would say that I think of it more of a mixed bag.
Thanks so much. And I think Edie would like to add something at this point as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have never heard so many different ways of saying the glass is half full. I think is the phrase that I used on the podcast. We've just put out on COP26 today, which is the podcast of the We Are All Human Foundation, Global Goalscast. A couple of people that I spoke to might be worth thinking about. I spoke to Mary Robinson, who's the former president of Ireland. She's the chair of the Elders. And the elders put out a very strong statement saying how disappointed they were with this particular issue. So depending on where you came from, I think that gives you the lenses that you look at this particular agreement with. In some senses, I spoke to the head of the IRC, David Miliband, who said, well, given the lack of coordination we've seen on COVID-19, and he's particularly referring to getting vaccines to the poorest in the world, should we really be that surprised that multilateralism in this case fails to respond to an emergency, even one that we've known about for several years? I would say the positive is that, if I was going to highlight just one, of which I think you've already named several, the fact that they took out that statement from the Paris Accord that was, we need to meet every year if we can't get that target down fast enough, to we're going to meet again next year in 2022 in order to ratchet up. I would say that if on the glass half full side, that was one of the things I would point to as being positive.
Vasa, to bring you in here, are you more glass half full or glass half empty on this one?
Well, it's not something that you can look at as black and white, because it's international deliberations. There's geopolitical interests. There's also corporate interests that we saw with the fossil fuel delegation of being the largest delegation there. And that's just what we're dealing with when we're talking about COP. So realistically, looking at COP, it is positive that we came to an agreement, because it's not that easy for international deliberations to come to an agreement, especially an agreement that's the step forward. So I guess that would be my glass half full. But we also have to recognize that with my generation, and I think just generally with the world, there has never been such it's probably the UN and the corporate sector are at an all-time low of trust. And you can either look at this in two ways, whether, this promotes inaction amongst the public or it sparks action. And I think my biggest takeaway from COP and also the last IPCC report is that we have to do more, and that, even though we need government to come along, government is going to not be meeting the moment and how urgent it needs to meet the crisis. So we're going to have to do it ourselves, and we're really going to have to step up even more than we have and bring more people along the way. So it's a mixed bag. And if, you're not looking at it that way, then I don't think it's a holistic view.
And Matt, last but not least, what's your take on the conference?
Well, I feel like I do want to back up my fellow panelist, Emma, and her attempt to try and bring some positivity to what happened, because it's difficult to do so if you're working in this space, because you're trying to reconcile the fact that we are in a climate crisis. There are communities, countries on the front lines that are dealing with an existential issue right now, and then trying to find a way to reconcile that with what's actually happening in an international climate negotiation where everything is dictated by consensus. So it's worth remembering, the context that COP26 came out of. You look at COP24, COP25. I mean, those were COPs where the IPCC 1.5 degree report wasn't even formally welcomed and recognized. So the fact that there was this global consensus that 1.5 is how we should be defining success in the climate movement, I think was a huge win. With that said, was this the transformational change that was required to address this moment? Of course not. And while, as an American being over in Glasgow, it was great for, the US to be back and, set that goal at 1.5. The truth is we're not as a country in a position to be seen as walking that talk. I know the Build Back Better legislation still kind of, up in the air. But also, one thing that was difficult to accept was, you look at kind of within these COPs, there's these three verticals: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. On the loss and damage side, the fact is the US was one of the forces that blocked loss and damages from actually leading to a financial facility that would support those countries on the front line. So in a lot of ways, it was difficult to accept that, and it shows there's a lot of work still to be done.
Thanks so much, Matt. Yeah, I mean, you've raised some really interesting points. I mean, all the panelists have raised some really interesting points there. I've been thinking about how much we can reasonably expect of the COP process. I had a really good conversation in Glasgow with Mohammed Nasheed, who's the former president of the Maldives, who I had met previously back in 2019 also. And he, as many watching and participating will remember, he became a star at the 2009 COP in Copenhagen, when in the run-up to it, he did a really successful publicity stunt. He did an underwater cabinet meeting in scuba gear with all his cabinet ministers to publicize the very real likelihood that the Maldives will end up mostly underwater, that the highest point of the Maldives is 2 meters above sea level. It's entirely made up of coral sand. And it will disappear on current trends. And now 12 years later, he was back again at another COP. You know, he had high hopes of Copenhagen, as many people did. Copenhagen was obviously a great disappointment. Then he was back in Glasgow. And he has been saying to me and others, look, let's be realistic about what we can expect of a COP, because the whole COP process relies upon unanimous agreement between nearly 200 countries. And by definition, out of a process like that, you are not going to get massive, ambitious, structural, transformational change. So we need to be pursuing other avenues, in his opinion. The COP is important, we should keep doing it, but we've got to be realistic about what can be achieved with unanimous consensus. Emma, you've been to lots of COPs. Do you think Mohammed Nasheed is right on that, or do you think he's being too pessimistic about what we can achieve with the COP?
You know, I could compliment a big list of things that I feel that they were not pursued in this COP. And number one is the finance, for instance, loss and damages. I mean, the number of ones, but I would like to also put it in a perspective. And the thing is that we are in a very difficult geopolitical moment in history, probably one of the most complex ones, and very hard to achieve agreements in that context. You see that this raid has been COVID, no coordination whatsoever. The G20 never met. They never listened to the recommendations the WHO had made. So, you know, we are in that context. This is the background. So whether it could be the COP, it could be whatever, it manifests itself. Actually, you know, one of the things in my perspective that was positive was this agreement that China and USA did in terms of cooperation, because we know those are the elephants in the room. And how you can move, you know, whether, and I frankly, and I have to disclose for everybody to know, I have worked most of my life at the UN. I'm devoted to the UN. I know I'm not right now with the UN. I mean, I'm devoted to the UN, but I do think that it's easy to blame the UN. It's a very easy target. But if we didn't have the UN, we didn't have a COP, we didn't have IPCC, we didn't have the Human Rights Convention, and many other things. I think we are in a very difficult geopolitical context. And that's what is there. So within that, I feel that what is achieved in COP26 is remarkable, actually, because if China and USA would not have made that agreement, that would have been a mess. No methane, no deforestation, etc., etc. Now, I can tell you why I'm upset, because I am upset too. I would, you know, it's incredible that we don't have a facility for loss and damages. This is years, you know, and it's dramatic what's going on. It's incredible that adaptation is a minimum thing. What I do think that we need to move on those fronts. What is interesting, because at the same time in SDSN, Professor Sachs is leading a whole thing on finance, and what he would like, I mean, and is discussing with multilateral development banks, IMF, really massive stimulus in a way for the developing world that addresses post-COVID, but particularly also addresses climate change and biodiversity loss. So these are, you know, the kind of things that we should be moving forward. I was encouraged by the presence of youth. Youth was massive outside, but also inside. I bump into a lot of my friends' sons, children there. I said, what are you doing here? You know, it's interesting. So I thought the fact that the UN embraced so much the youth inside and outside is also a very positive thing.
Yeah, I really had the same sense myself. I think most of the most impressive people that I met at COP26 were in their 20s and younger, actually. And it was the contrast between people my age and older were often focusing on the reasons why things couldn't be done, the reasons why things were not politically realistic. And the people who were much younger were just simply looking at what needs to be done. And that's it. What needs to be done. They weren't asking for the moon. They were asking for things that need to be done and can be done. And they were not focusing on things like Joe Manchin. They were focusing on what needs to be done. So I did find that inspiring. One of these young people, Bruno Rodriguez, who's from Argentina, is a very impressive young climate activist. And he was talking about the COP, and he was saying, look, the COP process, of course, it's deeply flawed. And of course, there are limits to what can be achieved at the COP, but don't take that away from us. Don't stop paying attention to the COP. Don't stop taking it seriously, because as us from developing countries and countries that are poorer than Argentina especially, that's really the best hope they've got of being heard, because they're not heard enough at COPs and at COP26 among them, but they are heard to some extent, more than they are during the general flow of the global conversation. So that was a point from him that I thought was important. And I think your point on which other panelists have made as well, the lack of a loss and damage facility is obviously very sad. And it speaks to obviously a lack of solidarity from developed countries towards developing ones. And I think that comes down to one of the things that can be used to address that is storytelling, actually. And I think that's why it's good that we've got several storytellers on this panel, because I think, and it's something that in my own way I've tried to do as well. I think if you can bring across the stories of the people who are really feeling the severe effects and will feel them worse in the future, you can actually have a big impact that way. Edie, could you speak to that, about the role that you think storytelling, so I think this is something that you try to do a lot through your work. What do you think storytelling can achieve in addressing some of the problems that we've talked about and the symptoms of it? For example, this lack of a loss and damage facility, the lack of financial support for developing countries.
I mean, I think one of the most successful podcasts that we've ever done, in fact, for Global Goalscast, was about climate change. We followed Robert and Barney Swan as they trekked to the South Pole, relying only on renewable energy. And their message was very clearly that if they could go to the harshest place in the world, relying on renewable energy, we could all make some changes in our lives. And through that, through telling their story, we were able to look at how the ice was changing. We were able to look at what the melting ice was doing to the temperature, to the acidity, to all those kind of things. And I know, and Vassar is, by the way, very, very good on the possible damage to the ocean and really the threat that we face. But we were able to tell stories of lobster fisher people in Maine whose lives were being changed completely by climate change. We were able to go to several island nations and talk to people. You mentioned the Maldives, who could see the future of their homes being swept away. So, and just to tell you, as a result of listening to our podcast, there's a story that I like to tell about somebody who I've never heard of and have never met. He had been sent this podcast pushed by Apple, pushed our podcast, and he was listening to it as he was sitting on his hospital bed, and he had just been diagnosed with MS. And his doctor came into the room and said, this is the diagnosis. If there's anything you really want to do, and then I would suggest that you take the next couple of years and do those things, because I don't know how fast this, your disease is going to progress. And he'd heard in our actions at the end of every episode, we give people 3 facts that they can take away and look smart in front of their mother-in-law, and 3 actions that they can take. And one of the actions was you can go and join the Swans in their next trip, which is going to be to the North Pole. And you can learn about climate change and become an activist. And he was sitting on his bed. He said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And he applied to be a part of the Swans program. He went to the North Pole. He learned an enormous amount about climate change. He's changed his life. He's now an activist in Pittsburgh, and he started an NGO, which is helping other people with great challenges and disabilities to get involved in the climate debate. So that is the power of storytelling, is to make something, to put pictures in people's minds, to make them feel, and to make them feel that they too can be a part of the solution.
Thanks so much. It's really extraordinary how the power of a single story can often just change a person's outlook on so much. Vasa, in terms of the storytelling approach that you take, because obviously the Oxygen Project makes a lot of use of social media, and social media has a bad rap these days from many people. It's seen as, it's making teenagers feel more insecure about themselves. It's giving people a way to waste time looking at pictures of celebrities and so on. Do you think actually the work that you're doing shows that actually social media, when used right, can be very useful, including for helping people to engage on some of these really important issues surrounding climate change?
Yeah, so absolutely. Right now, social media, the social media platforms are the tools that we have, and they have enormous power. So they can be used for outlets of misinformation, and they can also be used for outlets of kind of just distraction, I would just generally say. But at the end of the day, they're super powerful, and that's where young people are, and actually people of all ages. And that's where a lot of people are getting their information from. So we've really run all of our campaigns through social media and digital media platforms, because that's where the audience is. And we're definitely willing to change the platforms, but we kind of will just cater to where our audience is. And right now, as I mentioned earlier, we have to get out of preaching to the choir, and we have to start disseminating this information, but also igniting the spark of activism within young people and people of all ages. And because, as IPCC report showed us, and I think it was just reconfirmed with COP, that no matter how much great work all of these panelists are doing, and as much great work as a lot of people at COP are doing, we're not doing enough to achieve 1.5 or 2.0. And so we have to start doing more ourselves. But we really need to bring more people into this movement. And so that's what we're trying to do. And with the climate crisis, it can be overwhelming for a lot of people, and overwhelming and can create paralysis. So, being able to identify and communicate with young people and storytell in a way, and also create organized activism through social media, it can provide the first steps to taking action. Because once you start taking action, then you break out of that paralysis, and you can ignite your own activism. So really moving forward, it's about storytelling in effective ways, especially around environmental issues that might be harder to communicate, but really storytelling in an effective way. And then, adding that organized activism component, because as activists, we have to get more organized and more strategic if we want to make the change that we want to see.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to think about. Now we have so much more technology available. We can do this event online, for example. We can use social media in various ways. And there's also the question of what importance do we now attach to those in-person events? I mean, I had a really interesting exchange on LinkedIn earlier this week when I published a post talking about how do we bring in more diverse voices to things like the COP, COP27 and COP28. And I was thinking perhaps we could make better use of video link technology to have calls like this one, because something that's amazing is that you now have, I've traveled to a lot of extremely poor parts of the world, but in most of them, within at most a 3 or 4 hour drive, there's going to be a town with a hotel that has a decent internet connection. So even if someone is an extremely poor rural person, if you're an event organizer and you really want to, you can organize a car to bring them to that hotel. You can help them to get set up and to just speak into the camera and get them prepared properly and help them to share their voice with an international audience. And they need a lot of maybe they haven't used Zoom before, but it is now possible to do that with the appropriate level of support and assistance. And it's an opportunity now to dramatically widen the scope of voices, the range of voices that we have in events, including at events like COP26. You could also have a greatly expanded program to actually help people to reach those events in person, help them to get passports, help them to get the logistics organized, because I think it would probably help for many of the delegates at COP26. Personally, I don't know what other panelists who were there thought. Personally, I felt that there were some people there who didn't really seem to be taking it that seriously. And I think if among the delegates were more people from very vulnerable communities who are simply there to share their stories with the help of interpreters in most cases, because most of the most vulnerable people in the world don't speak English, so they need help with language and so on, but that's not beyond the realm of capability for an organization like the UN or other events organizers. But Matt, EarthX, your organization, you organize a big event, the Expo, around Earth Day. And so what's your take on this? Because I mentioned this post I shared on LinkedIn. One of my friends on LinkedIn made the point, well, it's not about these individual events, it's about structural, long-term integration of people from different backgrounds around the world on an ongoing basis. It's not about just having a one-off event and then that's it for 1 year. So, as you know, people make these objections to the idea of excessive focus on events like the COPs. What's your take on the value that in-person big annual events can bring? Why do you think it's important to do Expo? And what's your view on the importance of events like COP?
Sure. Well, I think, especially in the midst of a pandemic, which of course we're still in, I think the value proposition has to be pretty significant for someone to get on a plane, travel halfway around the world and meet people in person. And so, the value is the ability to build trust, strengthen relationships, which make conditions more likely and more conducive to collaboration and partnerships. But you have to have that mindset going into it. The challenge still with all of these events and all of COPs is not just getting to the town where these events are being hosted, but it's access, right? I mean, you can go to Glasgow, but unless you have a blue badge that allows you to get into a lot of these rooms, your experience is going to be markedly different from someone who does. And so we were talking about youth, earlier. Look, every successful social movement in human history, young people have been on the front lines and the tip of those spears. But, there were highs and lows from a youth participation at COP. I mean, one low, Youngo, which is the official youth constituency of the UNFCCC, of the COP, if it weren't for UNICEF, they would have only had a few dozen badges in the blue zone for every young person a part of the youth constituency of COP. The global focal points had to pay their own way to get to Glasgow and have a presence there. That is totally unacceptable. At the same time, you are seeing, younger people not just be a part of these national delegations, but interestingly, actually part of the negotiations. Mexico did something fascinating. A year ago, they reached out to environmental organizations and asked them to have their young environmental leaders apply to be a part of a rigorous negotiation training program. 300 people applied. They picked 30 who went through this program. Of the 30 graduates, they handpicked 4 to go to Glasgow and be a part of their negotiation team. And what they found was they were actually the most effective negotiators. And of course they were. And so I think that's a really interesting dynamic taking place. But I think for these kinds of in-person gatherings, you have to have a sense of what do you hope to achieve, give people a framework to plug into. EarthX happening in April, there's a whole ecosystem. We launched the UN Family Offices for Sustainable Development. It's going to have their inaugural summit in April, but it's not enough just to bring people together. We need to start plugging in those family offices so that they can participate in the global energy transition. And if you're not taking advantage of those convenings to help actually manufacture that momentum, it's a missed opportunity. So I think the more and more we can look at these in-person gatherings as an opportunity to amplify and accelerate those who are making a difference already, that'll be a huge win.
Yeah, I'm with you on the potential impact of having younger negotiators. one of the most impactful negotiators there for me was a guy called Juan Carlos Monterrey. He was the chief negotiator for Panama at COP26. We met in Glasgow. He made a very powerful closing address to the plenary on the last day. I put a clip on my Instagram actually where you can find it. And he just gave this, he talked about why he was disappointed, why Panama was disappointed, why young people all over the world were disappointed by the closing text. And he closed by just speaking directly to the youth of the world. And it was a fantastically powerful closing set of remarks, saying, don't give up, get involved politically, get involved in diplomacy. He wasn't telling people to worry about their personal carbon footprint, by the way. He was not. And I think it's very, we can talk about the emphasis on what we do as consumers versus what we do as citizens. So Juan Carlos is very much talking about what we do as citizens. He was saying, make your voice heard because you can. And Lance, I mean, coming back to this idea of storytelling and sticking with the subject of youth, I've been quite disturbed personally to hear about, and speaking to young people and hearing what they say about what they're feeling, what their friends are feeling. This eco-anxiety. This is not just young people being silly. I mean, this is serious. And when you think about it, they're pretty damn justified to be anxious about their future. If you're in your teens now, you should live for at least another 70 or 80 years. What's the world going to be like in 70 or 80 years? We don't know. There's so much uncertainty about the impact of feedback loops in the Arctic and so on. It could get very, very nasty indeed, just in terms of the physical impact. And then you think about what happens to, just for example, politics in Europe and North America, when you have enormous numbers of climate refugees coming from Latin America, coming from Asia and the Middle East. You've already seen in Europe, for example, the far right in Europe has been massively empowered by the problems in Syria, which in turn has followed the worst drought on record in Syrian history. You have almost fascist parties that are on the rise, promising strong borders. This is, for me personally, this is really scary stuff. And if you're going to be around for another 70 or 80 years, then I think you're right to be scared. But one thing that's troubling to me is that there's, in some cases, a certain sense, I think one of the panelists used this word paralysis among some people, the sense of powerlessness, the sense of, we don't know what we can do. The FT Climate did a poll on Instagram asking FT Climate's Instagram followers what they were doing in their life. And a lot of people wrote back saying, I've decided not to have children. That's my contribution. And for me, that's very disturbing. I think the answer to the climate crisis is not less human life, personally. I don't think that's the road to go down. I think we need to think about changing the economic system. So Lance, from your point of view, do you think the conversation around climate change in some cases has got onto a bad track in terms of people are putting the focus on not having children, instead of thinking, like Juan Carlos Monterrey was saying, get engaged politically, focus on improving the system that we have? How do you feel about the narrative, and what role do you think organizations like yours, the Brooklyn Story Lab, and other organizations that are involved in communication and storytelling, what role do you think you can play in helping people to feel motivated and helping people to really start making their own personal impact in a positive direction?
Well, you raise a lot of interesting points in this question, and I think that first and foremost, storytelling is an incredible tool to help drive narrative. Our mission statement is that we teach purpose-driven organizations how to think and behave like media companies, because basically every individual, every organization, everyone is a media company these days because of social media, and no one needs the middleman. I mean, I'm a former journalist, so I say this with respect to the FT because I've 30 years in journalism, but no one needs the middleman of journalism anymore to get their message out directly to the public. So being able to take ownership of that and have agency of that story is very important. The movement about not having kids is a very real movement that's it's felt by a lot of the younger generation, and I do understand it. I have kids myself, but I can understand the terror that comes ahead as we rocket closer to planetary destruction. So it's very difficult for me to take an opinion on that because everyone has to make their own decision on that. But obviously we have a hopeful message, and we try to utilize storytelling to tell the best message possible. And you were talking about Panama earlier. There was a team from Panama, from the Kuna people, who made the world's largest mola sail, like that reverse applique style of art, those mola creations. And so that is in many ways a story woven together by fashion. And craftsmanship and artisan work. So I think stories can take many forms. It doesn't have to be words. It can sometimes be a presentation of a creation like that.
It's a really important point. There are so many ways for personal contribution. Please do go on. Yeah, that's it.
I just wanted to jump off of that question that you asked and jump off of Lance, because I'm 26 years old, and so I kind of fit in this interesting time frame of the looming 7 years that we have to turn things around, 6-7 years, possibly even quicker. And especially around having kids, I think it's more the question of, what future would you be leaving your children? And especially as a, middle-aged 26-year-old, it falls at an interesting time where you're, is it responsible to have children and bring them into a world that, we're basically in the Pleistocene? And if we, continue on the trajectory of planetary decline that the IPCC report said we are on, and it will take massive transformational change that the world has never seen before to overcome that. And we really don't know which way things are going to go. And my generation and younger generations are very hopeful because, to be honest, we don't have the leisure of not being hopeful. I mean, we have to be hopeful because that's where our motivation comes from. And really, at the end of the day, if we want to have a livable planet, then we have to not fall into that paralysis that we were talking about. So it's not just about children. And I don't think that's really what we should be concerned about with the younger generation, because I think the answer would be not having children, but also a ton of other sacrifices that young people are looking at having or making in their lives because of the thought of runaway climate change. Edie was talking about earlier, I work on ocean issues, and one of the campaigns we run is to get a moratorium on deep seabed mining. And something that I was very frustrated at COP was that while we're in international deliberations over an area of the entire Earth's surface, which is the largest carbon sinks and is our global commons, not once was that on the official agenda talking about these international deliberations to open season mining in our international commons, the most biodiverse region on the planet, produces the oxygen we breathe. It's just like the forest. I mean, Emma reiterated how happy she was about forest conservation, which I am definitely too. But there was a lot of irony of making all of these commitments to ocean preservation and to the climate crisis, while these same countries are in international deliberations to open up our global commons to mining and doing irreversible damage. So for me, if mining happens in the next decade of the oceans, I would very much consider not having children as well, because that is our lifeline. And if we're going to continue on this trajectory of planetary decline, I think that's an absolute valid frame of mind to have. And also when there will be so many climate displacements of people and resources that will need to be used by people that exist on the planet, I think those are considerations that, conscious young children young people, the decisions that we're faced and will have to make.
It's a really powerful message. And I think you're certainly not alone in feeling that way. And I think it shows how badly humanity is messing this up, that people are now, many people like you are thinking the outlook is looking so bleak that I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable necessarily bringing a child into this world. I think that is, I hope for our political leaders, that is something they should take seriously, because that is very starkly reflective of the wrong path that I think we can all agree that we're on. We just have a few minutes before we wrap up. There's a question from an audience member, which I'd like to throw to Emma, given your experience at the UN. So the question is, I've been confused about how the government's promises work. Are the countries agreeing to pass legislation to require companies to make changes? If they can't influence business, does that leave things up to consumers to push for change? I think it's a really interesting question, because I think, my personal take on that is that, well, the governments are not changing the laws in such a way yet that is really forcing transformational change in the private sector. Companies can still make a lot of money from developing and exploiting fossil fuels. There was a public listing of a coal company here in London. It was 5 times oversubscribed on the market. So huge investor enthusiasm for coal companies here on the London Stock Exchange. You can still make a lot of money out of fossil fuels these days, because the economic system, the tax system, the whole way that the economy works still enables companies to make a lot of money from things that are damaging the environment. So, Emma, do you think we should expect much to change there, be it through the UN process or companies acting individually or through bilateral agreements, that companies will start taking action that changes the incentives for companies, changing the law so that companies can no longer make so much money from fossil fuels?
I think, frankly, this is something that has to be taken out of the legislative process in the countries. And as you can see, the lobby that was at COP26 of fossil fuels is even stronger in the Congress, I would say, for instance, of this country, the United States. So it's very hard to pass the legislation, but that's where it should be. However, I think the strong pressure that is coming from the consumer side and from the people in general, citizens, like you said, is making an influence, is making a difference. I could even see the behavioral change of the companies, not necessarily fossil fuel, but in general, companies don't want to be on the wrong side necessarily. There is a lot of pressure of the consumers. But in an ideal world, this should be legislative. We should be clear about incentives, we should be clear about penalties, we should be clear about costs. And I think hopefully we will move to that. But it's very hard. The lobbies are strong, very powerful. They control Congress people. They control many things, because this is the center of the power. And we're trying, it's like a revolution. You're trying to change the power in place. But I think we have to work on all fronts, including the courts. There's lots of things that are happening in courts too, and I think we have to try everything. But certainly, the power of the consumers at this moment is pretty strong compared to others.
Yeah, really interesting points. And I think you mentioned that in an ideal world, things will be different. So we'll never have an ideal world, of course, but we could have a different world, because one thing we haven't yet tried on this issue in particular is really massive engagement at the political level from the general public. For that to happen, of course, we need to address this sense of powerlessness that many people have. I think that's something that all of us here on this panel in our different ways can help in some small way to address, because as you say, that the power of the corporate lobby is very, very strong, the amount of money they can wield. But just in the US, for example, there are over 300 million citizens, and among whom most of them are adults with the vote. So that's a pretty powerful body, actually. If the people, if the general public really start thinking, well, actually, we can do things as citizens, we can get more involved, then that's something that I think a lot of those political lobbyists would be extremely nervous about. So with luck, that's something that we'll see more of in the months and years to come. Thank you so much to all our panelists. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I think that was a really frank and very, very constructive conversation. I certainly learned a lot from it. So thank you very much again to all our panelists, and thank you again to everyone who tuned in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.